Okay, now I officially begin, so you start from here. I have to do a quick presentation of this initiative, this seminar. In fact, the first thing I have to say to you is about Jan Toporowski, who he is, because I presented him in the course of the International Monetary Economics, but I think it is the first time that most of you meet Jan Toporowski. Jan Toporowski is one of the most brilliant, maybe the most brilliant monetary macroeconomist right now. He has had a long and rich and varied life, not all in the academic world. I just remind his main books. The first one, I think, published by Elgar, was about the 1987 stock exchange crash. The second was, I think, The End of Finance, 2000 or something like that, a title which is a double meaning, as you may imagine. Then there was a book on theories of financial turbulence, right?
Financial disturbance.
Financial disturbances, I always mix the two up. Financial disturbances, and this book has a second edition in Spanish, and I think it will have a second edition also in English, right?
Yes.
With some changes in the parts on Marx and Dymsky. Then he published, after the 2007-2008 crisis, a book on title Why the World Needs Another Crash, a provocative title. And last but not least is the intellectual biography of Michal Kalecki that we are presenting today. We actually presented the first volume a few years ago. Now he has published the second and final volume. I also want to remember that he published a book in honor of Tadeusz Kowalik, which was dedicated also to Rosa Luxemburg, or probably should be said Róża Luxemburg, since she was a Polish, or a Pole. What is the right?
A Pole.
She was a Pole. And Michal Kalecki, another Pole, and Oskar Lange, another Pole. This is the first thing that I have to say. I have to say also another thing. Actually, my university asked to do this, but I am happy to do this, to remember to everybody that today is the Women's International Day. It is not a holiday. It is not Festa della Donna. In fact, the origin was in a proposal, 1910, I think, of women in the German social democracy. The proposal, almost 20 years later, became what we know today as the 8th of March. In fact, today, it has been proclaimed all over the world, and also by some trade unions in Italy, a strike. I am of the old school. That is, when one does a strike, he does not go to work. Today I made an exception, because I would adhere to the strike. But the two seminars today of Jan Toporowski were too important that they couldn't be shifted. So I'll do what I never want to do. That is, I'll say my university that I did the strike, so they take the money from my wage. But as you see, I'm here working. The university says, remember the contribution of women to economics and all that. I did my dissertation with Tadeusz Kowalik. This is the book. As you see, it is very, very worn. I have also a dedication, because I did a dissertation in December 1976. The book went out in Italian translation January 77. So it was a disaster, but I must say that we were more or less in agreement on most things. So I have the dedication also of Tadeusz sometime after.
This is Tadeusz Kowalik's book.
Yes, it is on Róża Luxemburg. It is very easy, however, to find a connection. Not only Róża Luxemburg was an economist, she had a professional degree she had a PhD actually in law and economics in Zurich, if I remember well, but she is very linked to what we are doing today, because Kalecki, as we will see, in many ways anticipated the so-called Keynesian revolution in the early 30s, and he could do that because there was the seminal contribution of Róża Luxemburg in the accumulation of capital and in the anti-critique that she wrote at the beginning of this century. So I give the floor to Jan Toporowski, which will present the main feature of his biography.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much, Riccardo. Thank you very much for this very kind invitation. And I thank you all for being a generous audience here and at my other seminars. I don't want to take up too much time because I'm curious to know the comments of my colleagues sitting here. But I'll just make actually three remarks. One is how I myself came to Kalecki in a way that is you may appreciate, or students here may appreciate. When I graduated from university with my first degree, I got my first degree was in sociology and political science, and I got my first serious job with a firm with the institution called the Church Commissioners for England that runs the portfolio, the wealth of the Church of England. My parents, who were Catholic, they've died since, but of course they were scandalised because it was the Church of England. But this didn't matter. Because I had done one course in economics, I was put into the Stock Exchange Investments Department, and this was my first experience of finance, direct experience of finance and fund management. This was, and it was a particularly exciting time because shortly after I arrived, of course there was the oil price shock. Shortly after that, the London stock market crashed. Two brokerage houses collapsed. After that came a property collapse, a collapse in real estate, and it was followed by the collapse of a number of smaller banks and almost the collapse of one of the largest clearing banks in England. And I thought, this is very, very interesting. The economy descended into inflation and mass unemployment. I thought this was very, very interesting to find out why and what were all the connections. So I went to Birkbeck College and registered for a degree, a master's degree. I had to do a graduate diploma first and then a master's degree. And I very well remember the professor, the head of department, giving us one of the early lectures in which he stood in front of the class, and he said, what I'm going to show you in economic is what we do in economics, which is we do general equilibrium models. Why general equilibrium? Well, because this is the method of analysis in economics. And if you look outside, you see that the economy is in equilibrium, is in general equilibrium. And having come from a day at work where everything clearly was falling apart, I thought there's something wrong with this. And I didn't, I started becoming disillusioned with my studies. And then in the library, I remember downstairs, I found a small volume of essays by Kalecki, and I'd never heard the name before, but he was Polish, so I thought maybe I should find out something more about it. And I found there the essay on real and money wages, or money and real wages, which which is perhaps the best summary of his theory of the business cycle in a non-technical way. It's entirely non-technical. It explains the theory of the business cycle, really the high point of Kalecki's analysis. And it suddenly dawned on me that this is an economist who understands economics, who understands the way the economy, the capitalist economy works. So that was how I came to Kalecki. And then I wrote, after I finished my master's studies, I registered for a PhD. I did some more work. I published some of Kalecki's, translated and published some of Kalecki's essays, and wrote, I think, 1 or 2 articles. But I was still working in finance. And in 1987, my career in finance failed. I used to refer to myself as a failed banker. It was, but it was my career that failed rather than the bank. And I moved into academic life. And in 1989, I was invited, it's exactly 30 years ago, I was invited to go to Budapest in the dying years of communism there, to a conference on Nicholas Kaldor. And among the other people who were there were 2 very fine Kaleckians, Geoffrey Harcourt and Peter Chrysler. And Geoffrey and Peter one day knocked at my door, came into my bedroom and told me that my destiny is to write the intellectual biography of Kalecki. And and I was going to do this with Peter Chrysler and another guy called Bruce McFarlane. So this took a very long time because at various points Peter Chrysler and Bruce McFarlane dropped out, and I ended up doing it on my own, and it's now... So this is one of the reasons why it took 30 years to do this. Let me move on to my next point, the value added in this biography. Well, the first volume, which you can see up there, is really history and background, and I think doesn't really add that much, apart from some personal correspondence, to the understanding of Kalecki. The second volume, which is... okay, Riccardo.
So I use mine. Yeah, thank you.
I don't know whether this will... It's rather shiny, okay. The second volume, I think, is rather richer. It contains new papers and correspondence. Correspondence that Kalecki had actually there were some other new papers in the first volume. And the first volume is notable for the falling out, for the quarrel between Kalecki and Keynes's followers in Cambridge. Keynes actually remained remarkably loyal to Kalecki, and this is visible in volume 2. Kalecki had no connections in Britain. He spent the wartime in Britain, which is what saved him and his wife's lives because they were Jewish. And Keynes supported him very generously. Kalecki worked in Oxford. There are new papers and correspondence here, and second, in particular, one of the things that I picked up on was Kalecki's writings on money, monetary relations, and finance. This to us is very important. Kalecki didn't think that was important because he would drop this material, he would cut it out in subsequent editions of his paper. Maybe he was trying to shorten them, but in particular because I think he saw the business cycle as being the most fundamental element of his theories, of understanding what Marx called the laws of motion of capitalism, how capitalism evolves. So I've tried to put that back in. Related to this is, I think, something which has been underrated in the past, and that is the extent to which Kalecki came out of the discussions of the Austro-Marxist school. And Kalecki mentioned in his own work the influence of Marx and Rosa Luxemburg. What he did mention was the work of Rudolf Hilferding, and Hilferding being at the root of the business cycle theories of the many of the business cycle theories in Central Europe and in Germany in the 1920s and the 1930s, and where you can find elements of what came to be Kalecki's theory. So this link, I think, is quite important. It's missed out in the collected works of Kalecki because at the time when the collected works were done, there was a preoccupation with the relationship between Keynes and Kalecki. And I'm very, very happy to talk about the relationship between Keynes and Kalecki, but this is not a new discussion. And finally, I think I should mention, and by no means least, I should mention on International Women's Day the role of his wife Adela Kalecka. I didn't know Kalecki myself, but I knew Adela. She was a very faithful and loyal person, but because of this, she was a very faithful and loyal wife to Kalecki. I think because of this, she rather hid her own qualities and her own work, and mention has already been made of the great Polish Kalecki and Tadeusz Kowalik, who worked with Kalecki. Before Tadeusz Kowalik died in 2012, before he died, he gave me a folder of papers, and he said to me, "I know you will write. You're writing the biography of Kalecki. I want you. These are papers, publications, writings by Adela Kalecka. I want you to do some justice to them, give some mention to them, because they are mentioned nowhere else." So I did. I looked at them. There are some interesting articles that she wrote for the Polish press. She was a journalist. Some of the articles got published. There's an interesting diary of that she kept of their visit to Cuba in 1960. It's not very political, but personally insightful. So this I have included. I've been told by Michal Kalecki, the editor of Kalecki's collected works, that there is one error in this book, and that is that I call Oskar Lange a friend of Kalecki. I think it would be more correct to say that Lange was something of a rival, but Kalecki and Lange had known each other since the end of the 1920s. Kalecki wrote articles for a paper, the Socialist Review, which was published in 1931. In virtually every one of its issues, it only lasted a year before it was shut down by the authorities in Poland. But in virtually every issue, there is an article by Kalecki, and quite fundamental articles as well. And Lange subsequently was involved in getting jobs and assignments for Kalecki. Lange thought of himself as a true Marxist, and in 1952 he gave a lecture to the Communist Party school. Lange was an important, very influential, although less so in the Stalinist period, but he was an important member of the Polish Communist Party after 1945. After 1948, previously he was a member of the Polish Socialist Party. Lange gave a lecture on Polish economics in the interwar period, and he mentioned Kalecki, Marek Bright, and Ludwig Landau, who were two associates of Kalecki. He referred to them as left Keynesians, and who he defined as Keynesians who came to the conclusion that socialism is necessary. And he said that he argued in this lecture that they had one good feature about them and one disadvantage, one thing that was wrong with left Keynesianism. What was good about it was that it brought a lot of what he called bourgeois economists from an apologetic approach towards capitalism, seeing capitalism as being unable to do any wrong, bringing them to socialism. So this was supposed to be the good side of it. The bad side of it was that it introduced confusions into political economy, by which he meant Marxist political economy. Now, this comment disappears, but and Lange died in 1965. 3 years later, a vicious campaign was launched by the political authorities in Poland against Jews and so-called revisionists. And Kalecki's associates were attacked for precisely what Langer had accused them of doing before the war, which is of introducing confusions into political economy. And I think it's possibly with this background that Oshatinsky doesn't think that Langer was a true friend of Kalecki. But it is, I think, for me, it will be an intriguing prelude to my further studies on Oscar Langer. Thank you very much.
Now we have the comment of Gary Dymsky, who is now teaching in Leeds. You will have a lecture by Gary about Minsky sometimes later in this month. Gary.
Thanks, and I will make some brief comments now focusing on Jan's book, 2 books. Let me just say, first of all, that as Mehdi and I were discussing yesterday, this book is for adults. In the sense that it interweaves the stories.
Mehdi is that guy there for those who don't.
Yeah, that guy there.
We know, but they may not.
It interweaves the episodes of his life and his many struggles, which include being called an incomplete Marxist, with the theoretical discoveries and his dialogues with Keynes and with others. The material on his discoveries, his intellectual discoveries, assumes that you already have fully taken on board your Keynesian theory, classical theory, the debates about that. So I would urge you to kind of make sure that you're sort of ready for that, because the insights come quickly. These books are pretty short for the amount of things that they contain. Now, I think at the same time that Jan has done us an amazing service in several ways, and I'm going to characterize how. I'm going to begin by saying that I think the proper way to come into Jan's book to appreciate it is to remember a passage from the preface that Keynes wrote for his general theory. This famous passage, he writes, "The composition of this book has been for the author a long struggle of escape from habitual modes of thought and expression. The ideas here expressed so laboriously are extremely simple and should be obvious. The difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones, which ramify for those of us brought up, as most of us have been, into every corner of our minds." Now, I would say to you, if you have classes on, quote, modern macroeconomics, on the new consensus models, the need to escape from these habits of thought is as profound or more profound than ever. And I'll come at the end of my short presentation to an illustration of why it matters so much. Let's just start with the fact that Jan highlights the fact that in the end, the essential point made by Kalecki is, quote, "Capitalist profits are equal to what they, the capitalists, spend on investment in their own consumption." The profit investment equation is something that you have to keep in your mind. And I would just, this is picked up full force by Minsky, and I would just have to say that in some very brilliant work by Brett Christophers, the economic geographer, he points out that most recently in Antipode Journal, that the profits of the financial sector should be at the center of discussion about financialization, which has become a very popular topic for people. Now, Keynes agrees with this, but in presenting this point, as at many points in the book, one of the most fascinating and important parts is that Jan consistently shows through his archival work the disputes between Keynes, or the back and forth between Keynes and Kalecki and other interlocutors as well, very famous ones, but this was a part of it. And my second point, so that's my first point, he goes to the important thing. My second of 4 points I want to make is that basically here, this spotlight that Jan puts on Kalecki shows you that Keynes's own efforts to escape from old habits of thinking were very incomplete, and in particular on 2 points that are fundamental. I'll just mention them briefly and kind of tease you to go into the book and look for these points yourselves. One is that for Kalecki, the obvious way to study the economy was to go and look at the industrial and economic processes, to find the data and to sort it out. You start with the world as it works. He was an engineer by prior training. You see how the model works and really deal with it. Keynes, by contrast, keep in mind, was brought up in Cambridge in an intellectual environment, and he was a philosopher and student and so on. And he uses as his thinking tools not the core study of the economy, the industrial process, but what Jan calls intuitive frameworks. And this is nicely put, because basically those two intuitive frameworks are, first of all, Marshallian economics, and secondly, Wicksellian. Now, Marshall, that's the guy. When we have a course called Micro that we all take, and all that stuff, long run, short run, average cost, marginal cost, that's all Marshall. And basically, what Kalecki does, and I won't take the time to elaborate. Basically, Kalecki disagrees with one of the fundamental points in Marshall, which is that there's a short run, and then we somehow move to a long run. Kalecki says this is incoherent. It's an incoherent way of thinking about innovation, productivity, because we're in processes, and processes are never stable. And so this is a point that basically, now Keynes, this is part of where they're disputing, and there's a really interesting part about one article in particular that's rejected from Keynes's edited journal, the Economic Journal. Keynes doesn't want to hear about this. He doesn't want to hear it. So he's escaped, right? He's got his big point, aggregate demand matters and so on. But Keynes doesn't want to hear about getting rid of the long run, short run, because that's the way that he's trying to talk to these Marshallian trained economists like Pigou that he's fighting over their classical theories. Okay, I'll leave that there, and just to say that, Keynes also didn't like imperfect competition and so on. But the second one is Wicksell. Now, Wicksell is this very famous Swedish economist who has this idea that there's something like a natural rate of interest, and then there's like the observed rate of interest, and you can think of it like there's a profit rate, and then there's like what it should be, and you look at this difference between where the economy kind of is versus its natural state, and you can kind of gather whether it's in a boom or bust, because there's some kind of natural variation here. Now, this is something that's very seductive and embedded deep in all kinds of economic theory. I would mention in particular, Dymsky has it in his two-price model. But basically, again, Kalecki says, no, that's not what it's about. I don't have time to elaborate, but I'll just say that he sees the short-run rate as being about securing the financing needed for industrial production. Now, this leads to my third point, which is that Toporowski brilliantly, I think, on page 79, discusses the contrast between why Kalecki and Keynes cannot come to agreement on their way of doing theory. Their ways of doing theory are very different. He says that Keynes has an education which Kalecki never had. Now, for Keynes, theory was the organization of intuitions into a systematic form. For Kalecki, theory was an induction from his study of economic institutions and monetary circulation. Now, I'll leave that there. It's worth reading it and reflecting on it, over a glass of wine late at night. But the thing is that there's something here in this distinction between two types of theory that's fundamental today. Think of it, on the one hand, we have a number of Keynesians going with stock flow consistent modeling, going with wage-led growth models and so on, structural intuitive frameworks. On the other hand, think of the people who are pursuing agent-based modeling, chaos theory, complexity theory, and so on, ways of studying the world, very different ways. And so this idea that there's very different ways of being Keynesian and very different methods remains alive today. For me, the implication of that is that we need tolerance with one another about the ways in which we model, because no model can give us everything. And let me just make my final point, and that is that there's a nice discussion about my favorite Kalecki article is the political economy of full employment. And this discussion here is so interesting because Jan goes to the original lectures and discussions by Kalecki of this point. He tells us what it's all about. And what he points out is that there was originally I won't talk about it. If you've never seen that article, you got to do it. You'll just get jazzed. It'll just get fired up. Go hear Archie Shepp at the Bergamo Jazz Festival. It'll be the same kind of thing. But basically, he talks about that there's this prelude that's then cut from the published article about how you're going to finance this government spending that's going to keep everything balanced. And he does some thought experiments. In the interest of time, I won't go through them, but the thought experiments have to do with government basically just putting out some bonds and paying for what it wants to do. He then says it could be equivalent to just putting out some money and doing what it wants to do. This is more or less the claim that's currently put out there by the modern monetary theory, which has become very controversial in these recent days. And the thing is that Kalecki knows this. He knows that, well, modern monetary theory has been criticized as being naive, that there's going to be all these reactions, and that you can't just print money. There's going to be deflation and other things that are going to happen that can, or inflation that can be problematic. Jan knows, Kalecki knows this, and he shows how you've got to counter those things. And let me just say that, and so basically it shows that in his day, you could talk about having a more closed economy. You could talk about capital controls and other things that were clear responses to, in effect, some of the issues that a modern monetary theory like, aggressive expansion of government spending to stop unemployment would do. And the thing is that he said, the article is all about how capitalists aren't going to like it and you're going to have to deal with that. And my final quote here, I want to just do this, and I'm reading here from this wonderful second volume to say that business leaders, Jan writes, will always be arguing that their confidence in government soundness are reasons not to go to full employment. To overcome this, however, now quoting Jan, would require new social and political institutions that will reflect the increased power of the working class. If capitalism cannot adjust its mode of operation to this new reality, then it will show itself an outmoded system that must be scrapped. The new reality was unlikely to lead to fascism because that had flourished in Germany precisely because of the failure to secure employment in capitalist democracies. The struggle for full employment in capitalism is a way of preventing fascism. We are not only on International Women's Day, we're also 3 days after an announcement that Italy has now surpassed Spain in the rate of unemployment of young people. And this is a warning for us at this time of our current political life. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Now, Annamaria Variato, who doesn't need words of presentation. You know her already.
Thank you. So it's a very big weight on my shoulders after this introduction, yes. So I am an emotional person, so if I become emotional, don't pay attention because it's me. So I will try to give this presentation, assuming, in order to avoid to becoming emotional, making this presentation as it was a demonstration of a theorem. So my theorem starts after reading, not truthfully because I had not enough time to deepen the lecture, but I really appreciate your writings. The point I want to stress is a general point connecting to the idea about around the connection between trends and cycles, which is the main feature featuring Kalecki contribution. And so, so about this connection, I want to make 3 points. One about Kalecki himself. The other one relating to the book Jan wrote about Toporowski. And then third, about what kind of meaning this book can have for people who's not interested in Kalecki personally. But why to read Kalecki even though we may not be interested in Kalecki? And I think this is these pieces are very important. What about Kalecki? This book gives us a very clear measure of the Kalecki as a man and as an intellectual person. What kind of features I think come out very clear from this analysis? The fact that he had 2 focuses leading his activity. One, the attention towards dynamic processes. So the idea that capitalistic system can be understood only through dynamic relationships, not using the words of equilibrium, not using the words of a static approach. Then the second feature, and I will say something more after, the second feature is a pragmatic approach. So the thing that maybe you can theorize, you have ideas, but the very starting point from your analysis as being a scientist is the face-to-face, the reality, the world you have to, you see. So let's say something more about these issues. About dynamics, I think that this attention towards dynamic processes is a kind of genetic feature of people coming from Eastern Europe. Because somehow, if we see people like Schumpeter, Legenfood, Sweden, all of these guys, different strengths, different focuses, but all of them conceive processes as dynamic processes. So they do not look at points, but they look at the way in which things evolve through time. And so this feature is absolutely at odds and completely distinctive with respect to the German approach or the England approach. England approach is an approach of equilibrium. German approach is an approach of destiny. So somehow this is completely different. Equilibrium and destiny are the feature of the mainstream, and it is not possible to make the things of dynamic processes, the way in which we conceive dynamic processes, compatible with these ideas. And so somehow that's why during his own life, Kalecki was put in a struggle, because his way of being contradicts the mainstream and the language of equilibrium and destiny. Then, from the point of view of pragmatic approach, we have the point that what is the meaning of being pragmatic? One is being intellectually honest. And so the fact that if we want to build a theory, then we first we have to face reality. First we have to observe, and then to make statements after having observed. Otherwise, there is a self-reference, there is tautology. Second, what about pragmatism? And this is a connection, I think, with the Luxembourg Marxian tradition. In my courses, I always come up with a quotation about Rosa Luxemburg saying that a capitalistic system is governed by anarchy because capital is the ruler of the system. Nevertheless, after having said that behind capitalism there is anarchy, Luxemburg says, well, anyway, there's a point in being an economist, because being an economist means to try to attempt to change reality. And again, then it is a very strong contrast with respect to the idea of destiny. There's no destiny. Destiny is not there. Destiny becomes. And so the economist has a very strong importance in economic life because he moves, create the condition for the economic system to change and to become something we like or we dislike. So I think it's a very powerful and different way to face economics. About the history of a man, Kalecki, it turns out that his life is non-linear, very difficult, a man of both academic and institutions, not a diplomat, because he was not a servant of the institution, but he had to learn. In order to survive there, he had to learn how to survive there. And this is not a very pleasant, I think, observation, because it is kind of very sad observation. Then, second point, so this is about Kalecki. Then about the way in which Jan presents the books. I think that this book is just another piece in which we see how the talent Jan shows. I enjoy very much his books, his writings. I think he has a talent in literature. So that's make the reading of the book a very enjoyable experience. And so this is a talent. And so good for you. About this specific book, I think it's very interesting to have this history in which we have Kalecki coming up in our mind, flesh and bones. Like we can feel him. We can at some point become as a part of his life and his struggles. Okay. But then, so not, I have not to become too much a part of his Kalecki life. But why I'm becoming emotional? The point comes because when I ask myself, what about this effort? What the meaning of this effort? Of course, this is a part of the preference, Jan says. Maybe it's somehow the part of the destiny, Jan. But what about other people? And so I've tried to concentrate on this book, and I realized that maybe this book is a sort of a cycle. So not only Kalecki's lifetime was a cycle from the beginning, studying cycles, through the end in which there was the attempt to reconcile the issue between trend and cycles. So the final point somehow goes back to the beginning, but in a different way. So it's an evolution, but also the book is exactly the same. I usually, when I start to read the book, I read the sentences and the dedication. I saw Toporowski.
Tadeuszowi.
Tadeuszowi, okay. I honestly say I do not know your connection. I did not know your connections. And so when I was reading, I say, okay, maybe it's a friend or a dear person. But at the end of the book, I found the reference to Thaddeus, to the other Thaddeus, important Thaddeus. Yeah. And so I thought that this was the connection. So the connection was the connection with a friend. With a friend which is not necessarily a known person, but a friendship in the sense of intellectual meaning. And so it turns out to me that also the meaning of Thaddeus. So there is a destiny even in the name. So Latin says the name brings the destiny. Thaddeus means the one who make praise. And I think that the Thaddeus the important Thaddeus in the life of Kalecki was the one who gave us the way in which ideas Kalecki were preserved and came until us. And so that's the point. The point of the circle is a circle, trend, and cycle, stating the meaning of being an economist, a non-mainstream economist. In some sense, this intellectual biography says that there are contradictions and paradoxes in this kind of choice. So, one part of the paradox is the fact that if you choose of being an heterodox economist, your life is filled by solitude. You are put more or less in the land of nobody, because nobody wants you. You somehow want to overcome barriers, but you don't succeed necessarily in this effort, at least personally. But in contrast, as the experience of Kalecki shows, somewhere there exists a Thaddeus. And as long as we have at least our own Thaddeus, there is hope. The hope to survive against the space, against the time, in a place which is timeless and spaceless, but then it becomes eternity. And so you win the war forever. And I think this is the most important thing that we have to have in our experience. And so this book is a very enchanting experience in this sense, because it gives us disenchantment, but gives also a strong hope. It gives the sense of being an economist. And so thank you very much, Jan.
Thanks to you also, Annamaria, very much. I will try to give the students some references to things that we have said in the course or will say in the course. So nothing will appear immediately as clear, but in the course of our macroeconomics course, it may become better. I want to start with this kind of book, which is defined as an intellectual biography. It may be thought to interest the history of economics thought crowd. So I refer to my first lecture in this course, where I distinguished different ways of dealing historically with economic theory. And I distinguished four ways The first is the mainstream view. It is a continuist view. You look at the history of economic thought from the present situation, which is a calm territory. The errors, the history of economic thought is the history of the errors which have been purged. The second view is the Kuhnian view, the idea that there are cycles of normal science, paradigms which break down for some reasons, and we are in a revolutionary situations, and they are followed by other paradigms. And this has been used very much in economic theory and could be used to understand Keynes and Kalecki. I don't think that this is the most fruitful way to read Jan's book. Jan has nothing to do with the first view, as knows very well the second. But I think that the best ways to look at the book are the other two views on how to look at history in economic thought. That I called, on one side, history of ideas, the history of idea approach. Look at the context, even at the language of the author. And the second approach, it is the fourth in my lecture, is what I called, with a reference to Schumpeter, an history of economic analysis approach. In the history of economic analysis approach, you do, in a sense, the same thing as the mainstream. You begin from the present situation, but it is not a calm territory. It is a territory where there is a fight between alternative approaches, because there are open issues to be dealt with. And they have not been adequately resolved in any of the traditions, including the heterodox or heretic one. These I also called reading backwards. It is an expression that we find in Piero Sraffa's written notes in Cambridge. Of course, if you do an history of economic analysis, you are not so much interested if what you are saying is strictly true about the author. Of course, there is a risk that you do arbitrary statements. So the history of ideas is a good quality control. Now, if one looks at the book by Jan, it's immersed in the history of ideas, and it is full of context. I think that, however, the book is implicitly a book in the history of economic analysis, that is looking backwards from a certain perspective. I have many points, so I will have to go not with a theorem, but with thesis, very, very quickly. I will show you more or less the 2 pages of the table of contents. This is the first page. But first a background, because maybe you don't know this already, though maybe I've said it, I will say in the course. The background, which is better explained in the first volume, is that there are many reasons to believe that Kalecki anticipated the so-called Keynesian revolution, the principle of effective demand, in his writings, unfortunately in Polish, in the early 70s. But he began from Marx. The 30s, yes, sorry. The early 30s. The general theory is 36. These writings are 33, 32 even. The point is that Keynes was trained in the Marshallian tradition, and Kalecki in the schemes of reproduction tradition. And from that, there was this idea that investments determines profits, and the reading of the profit equation, and so on. In this second volume, what we have, and I don't spend much time in it, it has been already named several times, we see the development of his theory of the business cycle, because a specific feature of Kalecki is that he put more and more his view of the principle of effective demand in a business cycle approach. There is no given trend. In a very famous quote, which is also in the book, actually the long period does not exist. We have a sequence of short periods. These lead Kalecki to criticize very much the growth theories of the neoclassical variety and of the, at the time they were called the neo-Keynesian variety. Let us say Solo, but also Harold is criticized very much by Kalecki. This, if not for politics, should have been very interesting for theoreticians in the 70s, when actually this problem came to the fore. Then you have the theme, which is not only in this chapter, of the political economy of full employment, which is more generally linked to a famous article of 43 by Kalecki, The Political Aspects of Full Employment. Here I have some differences of accent probably with Jan. Let me, however, open a parenthesis. People may be surprised that close friends, and even more than friends, may engage in a reciprocal critique. But critique, in my view, is not criticism. Criticism is just when you point out the error of somebody else. Critique is a different thing altogether. It's to look at the internal truth of the position that you criticize and find alternative ways to develop the questions and maybe sometimes even the answers that are given. Now, in reading the article of 43, maybe even more than the conscience of Kalecki himself at the time, what strikes me, maybe more than Kalecki, is the fact that Kalecki is saying that yes, full employment may be realized, and it is even in some economical interests of the capitalists, but they will resist it so much so that the situation of full employment is temporary. And this is very, very, very strong. And the reasons why it is temporary are interesting, because they are different than what has been stressed very much by post-Keynesians. They have to do with the control of the capitalist class on workers in the labor process, not just the wage, in the labor process. And this makes him much more than an incomplete Marxist. The second thing, which also has something to do with Marx, is that the capitalist does not want a political and social intervention on the composition of output. So even if they do profits, they don't like that the state may intervene with certain kinds of redistribution or even direct type kind of expenditure. Then there is the strongest part in the history of economic analysis approach of Jan. He knows that actually in Kalecki there is something that other people does not see. There is a novel monetary approach. Jan gives the monetary background and some details of the Kalecki's monetary alternative. The monetary background is the discussion in the early 20th century, since the end of the 19th century until 30, 31, 32. It is what Keynes called, and this is a term used by Jan, the neoclassicals. I told you that for Keynes, the classicals were those that we now call neoclassicals. That is, the Varasian marginalists and the usual standard. Who were the neoclassicals? Those who stress the disequilibrium, the imbalance between investment and savings. I agree completely with Jan that for Kalecki, and rightly so, and for the full Keynesian revolution, this is meaningless. Investments and savings are always equal. Kalecki was in this framework, and his novelty was to say, you see, let us put from the point of view of government expenditure as investment expenditure is self-financing. When capitalists spend, they actually, one way or another, inject money, deposits circulates, so that in the end they don't need to find new sources of finance. There is a lot of truth in these two things, but I think that the neoclassicals, in its meanings, were much more divided. That actually Wicksell was not the Wickselians that he's talking about. That is, I think that you have to distinguish financing to production and financing of investment. The fact that undistributed profits contribute to the process does not solve the problem of the injection of money in the first place. This is crucial in Schumpeter. It is strengthened in the book. Schumpeter is quoted only twice, because Schumpeter was the natural alternative of an out of equilibrium approach to capitalist development and cycles. I'm not buying everything in Schumpeter, but you see, it may be constructed a Marxian interpretation or Marxian reading also of the Schumpeterian stuff. And the same Keynes of the 30s, the treatise of money, was much beyond what Keynes understood at the time. It is very easy to construct the first two books, they are sections actually, parts, the first two parts of Keynes' treatise of money as a development of the schemes of reproduction. The point was that once you have an injection of money, say of 100 as finance to production, these may stay the same, but the decisions of investments are independent from the decisions of consumption. The investment share can increase, and this would produce inflation against the workers. This is the opposite of another neoclassical of the time, who is Hayek. The two had nothing to do, one with the other. You can even read some Kaleckian element already in the treatise on money. The real difference is that Kalecki, with many reasons, was arguing in an imperfect competition approach, whereas actually Keynes arrived to similar conclusions in what he thought to be a perfect or free competition approach. But this would be, of course, longer to discuss. Then there is the last part, which of course interested me very much, the part, I think it is in the academic freedom, in which there are two fundamental essays. One on 1968 of the schemes of reproduction by Kalecki, and the other on 1967 on Rosa Luxemburg and Tugan Baranowski on the problem of effective demand, I think, or something like that. I inverted sequence because I suggest you, if you read these essays, to read in my sequence. Here, the key person is Tadeusz Kowalik, because Tadeusz Kowalik made an interview, then discussed with Kalecki, and had Kalecki having an history of economic analysis approach towards himself. Kalecki, only discussing with Kowalik, understood what actually he was doing in the 30s, just because Kalecki, I think this is the Kowalik, this is the expression of Kalecki. Kalecki said Kowalik knew everything about the history of economic thought, so he gave the connections. I would love to go into more details on this, especially because the essay on the schemes of reproduction appeared in the collection, Italian collection. It is like the Penguin in England, the Oscar. Oscar Mondadori, and I bought almost immediately. It was 68. I didn't know I would have become an economist, so it was, if not the first, one of the first writings, because this essay was included in a UNESCO collection of articles about Marx. Going very quickly to the end, the last, where is the crucial reform stuff? In the last disappointment, I think. One of the last papers of Kalecki was published in Italian when he was unfortunately already dead, and it was a paper together with Kowalik on the crucial reform. He goes back to the issue of Keynesianism and the policies of full employment, the one in the paper of 43. At the time, he went to this essay, again looking at the debate on reformism and all that in the Marxian tradition. His position was very provocative, especially for Marxists. His position was, look, Keynesianism succeeded in stabilizing capitalism for a long while. It incorporated, embodied, subsumed the working class, who is not anymore revolutionary. Where are the possibilities of revolution? In the students' movement of the 68 and all that, and in the third world. Unfortunately, I find really a bad timing. One could have understood this paper to be the one to be published in 43, and the one in 43 to be published in 70, because it was much more sulla palla, si direbbe in italiano, on the ball in the football, in the football game. And I discussed this with Tadeusz actually. It was published by Rinascita because he was a very well-known figure. He was a friend with Pesenti, but it is not that the Communist Party was interested in the transition. They could not say no to Kalecki, and Pesenti presented an article criticizing in a friendly, comradely manner Kalecki. And this is in the books, the collected works of Dymsky, etc. Just one last thing about the style. There is a great phrase in this book in which there are a lot of correspondence and this love-hate story, more hate maybe than love, between Keynes and Kalecki. So there is this essay which was rejected for the Economic Journal. Keynes was the editor. He sent it to John Robinson, another great economist, and we should remind here today. And he already, as an editor, this was an editor should not do. That is, he said this essay is awful, etc. She defended it all along. It was rejected because Keynes searched another referee, Kaldor, and Kaldor killed the paper as Keynes wanted. Don't believe that refereeing is something neutral, even though we are talking about giants. There is one criticism, though, that John Robinson advanced. She speaks of an inhumane style of writing of Kalecki. Kalecki was an engineer. He would have liked that economics was like physics. Unfortunately, it was not. I think that you differ from him on this. I differ from this hope that economics can be like physics. This book by Jan Toporowski is, come si dice capolavoro?
Masterpiece.
Is a masterpiece in style, in a very humane and controlled style. If I have to find which does not make necessary for an easy read. If I must make a comparison for those who have studied Latin, the comparison is not with Cicero, but with Tacitus, Tacito. The characters of Jan's writings are brevity, irony, being sharp and stringent. never says twice what you can say once in a perfect way. And I thought that Gary would have quoted this, but the end of the book is a masterpiece in the masterpiece. If I find a way to let you see. Supported by, he died on 17 April 1970. Supported by his devoted wife, Adela, he died as he had lived a relatively isolated figure with a personal following that was attracted by his ideas rather than his personality. Without material inheritance, class advantage, social position, an institutional base, or political support network, his isolation was the principal and proximate cause of his professional disappointments. But it also gave his mind that critical edge that is missing from the ideas of better connected economic thinkers, none of whom achieved so much by intellect alone. One of my masters was Norberto Bobbio in Turin. He taught us that you need to have a perfect beginning of what you write and a perfect ending. The rest comes along. And here you have a perfect circular structure. From the title, Volume 2 by Intellect Alone, to the closure of this wonderful book. Now we are open to your questions, if there are any, curiosities. I think we have probably two there on the right. And then we give the last word to Jan. We have even 5-10 minutes more given to us kindly by Urga, Professor Urga. Ivan Invernitz, who came here even though he is impaired, as you see.
Sort of it.
She too.
She too, broken.
So, I think that it's very interesting that you connected the biography of this author to his work. Also because I think that there's a plus in such kind of biography. I want to emphasize the fact that the most important, the economists that did have the most impact probably on the history were not economists by training, but were people that had a richer biography. So you have that Adam Smith was a moral philosopher, that Keynes didn't have any degree in economics, and Kalecki is an engineer. So I'm very curious to know from you, if it's possible, what did bring Kalecki to economics? I mean, how did he make the jump? How did he, and then I think this element of biography is connected with what both Maria Grazia Variato and Professor Dymsky were saying, which is the fact that somehow being heterodox means to not follow the mainstream, and these has consequences on your biography, of course. But at the same time, to be probably a little bit original and a little bit genius in a science, you should be an outsider in some extent. So to not have your brain completely crystallized and lose all your elastic capacity, you should be a little bit an outsider. So not just to read the main books, but goes around but then I will do an harsh criticism to Professor Dymsky, because when you say that you don't have to be trapped by let's say, the mainstream or a paradigm, and the corner of your mind should be somehow allowed, at least temporarily, to follow some other line of reasoning. That also means that you don't have to project the conclusion of other economists into your understanding. So if there's some other paradigm that makes some conclusion, then it's very bad to project those conclusions in your understanding, trying to justify with your understanding. You should follow the line of reasoning of the other, then which could be completely wrong, but you should suspend the judgment and follow the other line of reasoning. Why I'm saying so? Because you talk about MMT and capital control. Well, MMT doesn't talk about doesn't suggest capital control to compensate deficit spending, and there is one specific reason for that. Because there is a demarcation between post-Keynesianism and MMT, which is straightforward. The MMT start from seeing the currency as a public monopoly in terms of net financial assets of a currency. And the power, and these imply a power of the state in determining, let's say, the term of exchange of the currency, the value of the currency in terms of other currency and real goods. So that's why you don't need in MMT framework to control the exchange rate or trade imbalances with the capital flow, or not necessarily. I'm quite sure you never read an MMT suggesting, at least as an important issue, capital control. At least in the primary literature and in the primary, let's say, the main author. And I thank you for this. I'm very curious to see the professor Toporowski, expansion on Kalecki biography.
Mehdi Shoghi.
Just want to thank you for your great work.
They are students, just one word, they are students of the last years. I had a reading group twice. They went twice to the same. They always follow these events and sometimes the courses. They are models as students, except for one thing. They did not finish their studies, so I still await Mehdi's dissertation. Giovanna Verto, I think, still awaits. Okay, go, Mehdi.
As reading Kalecki makes the reader a little bit more intelligent, makes you more smart. And your book makes the reader smarter, I believe. I feel a little bit smarter now reading, although I didn't finish your book yet, but didn't arrive at the beautiful ending, which I was looking forward. So it was a little bit of spoiling the end of the book. Anyway, I couldn't help but ask you about Ishaq. As you mentioned in the book, he was an Iranian-born economist that went to Oxford. He was also very left-leaning, and he was sacked out of the Iranian Communist Party in the 40s. So he went back and wrote this book, which was his PhD dissertation, From Marshall to Keynes, which now is a classic. And he then went on, since he really had also, not only from the point of ideas, but also from the point of political commitment, followed Kalecki very nearly and went to the United Nations, being his colleague. He could be a theorist like Kalecki was, but he chose to write more of technical text for the missions of the United Nations, and he got also sacked from the United Nations, as Kalecki was sacked from the United Nations before him. Yeah. So Ishaq is an important figure. Now I know you put 30 years of effort in writing this biography. It means and that is why it's so great. So it really enlightened my way, because I didn't know Ishaq as you didn't know Kalecki when you started your studying economics, but I got to know Ishaq through Kalecki. and came this idea of writing an intellectual biography about him, this very, let's say, unknown figure in the Iranian also realm of thought. Actually, he has written 2 small essays in Persian, which I couldn't even read because they're not available yet. But they have made history. They're about the history of the workers' movement in Iran, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to ask you about Ishaq, and did you have contacts with his widow, or how did you, because you mentioned a interview with him on that, and he has written on the end of Kalecki's life and how he felt and so on and so forth, which is very dramatic kind of writing. But since he shared at the end, he ended up in Oxford being the only Keynesian. He called himself a socialist Keynesian. So, and he actually, when he died in '98, the new Labour policies were in the height of their popularity and so on and so forth. So he actually somehow had a, dramatic, tragic end of life, as Kalecki did. So they shared a kind of, say, destinies, parallel worlds. Something else I wanted to add about Gary Dymsky's beautiful comment. Of course, I've read it before. It was even more beautiful than he presented it, written form. It was that, actually, I think that Kalecki, and this is very relevant to me as someone who has studied statistics, Kalecki has this strange and very rare technique of problematizing data. He reconstructs data. Like, he produces new data from old data. He criticizes, not criticizes, he critiques the data to reconstruct the data. So he's not trapped in the usual traps that the economists are trapped in. So although he comes from the chaos of the daily data, of the time series, and he was a statistician, and he was employed as a statistician, but he was awarded for his theoretical capacity of criticizing, critiquing, and reconstructing, problematizing data from a theoretical point of view. So maybe I don't really share, like, I understand perfectly what you mean by saying, looking at the state of the fact, at the working of the capitalist system, but of course he, as Tadeusz Kowalik, has read in him, without him being aware of that, he had a deep theory. He had this rules of chaos in his mind. He has reconstructed the most crystal clear understanding of a accounting system of capitalism. And this was his, I think, guide in problematizing data. So he wasn't the one that in data we trust kind of guy. On the contrary, he took data, he looked into the data, he got into it, and from inside out showed that data shows something different from not only the first look, but elaborate kind of constructions of data would show, because. And I wanted to also point to something, maybe there will be a second edition or so on. Kalecki's first job as I would say, you called it a journalist, economic journalist, or business cycle researcher, in parallel with Kalecki in Institute of Research in Business Cycles. There was, and Adam Tooze in his first book actually mentions it, Statistics and the German State. The Konjunkturforschung Institute, directed by Ernst Wagemann, which he was also a kind of developmentalist economist, because he was born in Chile and has written books about Argentina, Chile, and so on and so forth. and he was actually had a crystal clear idea about money, as Kalecki had, as Schumpeter had, and has directed this research, which much bigger proportions to the Polish Institute of Business Cycles, but he didn't arrive at a critical standpoint towards capitalism. He didn't break through, really, although his discoveries are very important. But Kalecki's Luxembourgian legacy, his socialist legacy, made him a great economist, maybe the greatest macroeconomist, because he looked at capitalism not only with critique, but also with a hope and effort to go beyond it. And this is something that it's really rare. Not only the non-apologetic point of view, but the critique. Maybe someone has to read your book and write an essay about critique in Kalecki. It would be nice. Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Other questions? Any others?
Yes, I have a very quick question. Because I was wondering why among all the heterodox economists that can be maybe, if I'm not wrong, Marx, Keynes, Schumpeter, Kalecki, and Dymsky, why among them only Keynes was able to overcome the mainstream models of his time, and the others not? Was only a question of language, of their theories, or a question of maybe that Keynes find a fertile field for his theories to be valid?
Those two questions. Thank you. Time for your answer. If we do not have other questions, a lot of.
Okay, I mean, maybe there were.
15 minutes. So
Okay, maybe there will be other questions when I finished speaking. Let me start off by answering maybe the group of questions that were raised by the students. Okay, what brought Kalecki to economics? It was essentially a personal experience of the downfall of his father's business. His father ran a small textile business in the Polish industrial centre of Łódź, or it's about Lodz, but pronounced Łódź, and and this collapsed in the 1905 revolution and the aftermath of that. And I think this is written up in volume 1. When I was still feeling my way into Kalecki, and it was the reason why he had to break off his engineering studies, why Kalecki never had a proper university degree. One of the jobs that he did after that was business journalism, writing on on businesses, on markets, particularly the textile industry. There was a short-lived attempt to have a journal for the textile industry, and that didn't come off. But he wrote things there which actually have disappeared. So it was through writing about business corporations that he eventually got his first job with this Polish institute. On MMT, yes, there are very suggestive connections in the in Kalecki's writings that he was aware that when governments spent money, this was putting money into the economy and could have a stimulating effect. But he was also aware, if you read his development economics, he was also aware that you couldn't just assume that this money was going into the economy. It would circulate through the economy, and where would it end up? And the dangers that came from that, which is that particularly in a developing economy, the people who hold these hoards of money would attempt to convert them into foreign currency, because there's always, in particular, if an alarm is raised that there's going to be inflation. There's going to be inflation. Get rid of this money, buy dollar, convert it into dollars. Now, the standard answer to this is of course, capital controls. But actually, Kalecki had two other suggestions. One is to drain those hoards, first of all with a capital levy, a tax on holdings, a wealth tax in effect. And the second idea that you find mentioned in his works is issuing long-term bonds, because the long-term bonds not only take the money back to the government for expenditure, but maintaining it in internal circulation in the economy, but also mean that if you're going to have a market in those long-term bonds, they have to be liquidity has to be provided in that market, and that can absorb some of this excess liquidity that you would find in the private sector. So there are suggestions that he was aware of this problem of excessive liquidity, which you would get if you just followed a monetization of the fiscal deficit. Ishak and Kalecki. Actually, you mentioned, Mehdi, that they were sacked from the UN. It was not so much that they were sacked, but they found life impossible. And intriguingly, in the most recent things that I've read about this period, it was also after the worst period of McCarthyism. So when Hammarskjöld took over as Secretary General of the UN, one of the first things that he did was he shut down the FBI office in the UN, where the FBI was spying on, ostensibly, they were legally allowed to spy on American citizens working for the UN, who weren't supposed to be spied on. They were UN employees, but they were spying on other people as well, like Ishak and Kalecki. You might try getting the FBI files on Ishak, which might be interesting. Why they did leave was because they found life impossible in the UN, and I think that there are. So Kalecki leaves to go to Poland because his work is being controlled. Ishak because he gets offered a place at Oxford, and he finally decides that this will be more agreeable to him. What's interesting is that there are other people who were of similar views who stayed on, and what did they do? Well, they actually go off and they set up different branches of the UN. So the UNDP is set up. Malinowski, who was a very important friend of both Kalecki and Langer, close to both of them, went off and established UNCTAD. He's the great person who establishes UNCTAD. Why Keynes became heterodox? Oh, Kalecki and data. Yes, I mean, this is the source of his great, or this was the pretext for a lot of the arguments over Kalecki's work at the end of the 1930s and 1940s, and the criticism in Cambridge, because Kalecki took data and he said, look, this data doesn't cover the whole period. If you are doing any proper study, you inevitably find that the data is incomplete, or it doesn't give you quite the definition that you need from your theoretical studies. So Kalecki was adapting the data, and this caused outrage because the idea was, in accordance with Marshall's idea and the ideas of other of 19th century empiricists in statistics, was that you had a theory which would be a statistical prediction, and you tested that against the actual data. You weren't supposed to mess around too much with the data, because the situation now has been completely reversed. You know, you mess around with the data to get the conclusion that you want. But that's where Kalecki was coming from, because he wanted to see what was actually happening, and in most cases his adjustments were correct. Why Keynes became heterodox? I honestly don't know. I mean, I think that there are two aspects to this, of why Keynes, in particular, with such an orthodox background, becomes heterodox. I think partly because Keynes wanted to be seen as a controversialist, and sometimes you find Keynes putting forward ideas which were actually quite common, but which Keynes tended to put forward as deeply original and his own ideas. So, for example, the idea of fiscal stimulus. The idea of fiscal stimulus was widely accepted in the 1920s and the 1930s. There was, I seem to remember, I think the first time I ever met Skidelsky, he was writing a book on the politicians and the slump. And I said that there's an article by Hancock in which Hancock surveyed the economic literature of the 1930s and found that most economists of the time were saying, yes, do some fiscal stimulus. The Chamberlain government, the Conservative government before the Second World War, was trying to do fiscal stimulus, house building and building, there's a whole, in England they have these open air swimming pools, which are, for the English climate, not too suitable except for 3 months of the year, but they were being built in the 1930s for as a means of trying to get a construction boom going. Yeah.
I may suggest that maybe the answer, the question from the student, he was trying to ask why Keynes was heterodox but successful against the fact that instead Kalecki, Dymsky and other ones, they were heterodox but isolated.
Okay.
So that's it.
I think that the question has its own answer. Since he was the least heterodox and the general theory was constructed so that it was half heterodox.
It was very rhetorical and persuasive. There was a rhetoric exercise.
Yes.
I also think that you see that Keynes was shocked by the Versailles Treaty. I mean, his first attempt, or his first critical book, is the economic consequences of the peace, but it also exposed Keynes for what he was, who was an inside controversialist. He would come into the room and he would be the person who would be raising interesting questions, but not so interesting and so outrageous that they would put people off. And this actually raises the general question of are heterodox economists condemned to a life of solitude? I'm afraid to say that I actually think that this is to some extent true, that if you're going to be creative, if you're going to make a creative contribution, you have to get out of the commonplace discussion. But there are two things that worry me about all of the one thing that does worry me about all of this is that if you are uncomfortable about it, there's a tendency then to find a milieu that maybe you agree with, and to speak only to them. Yeah. And in this way, you become part of a silo. I mean, this is the problem of heterodox economics, certainly in Japan. I mean, people don't know each other. If you're a post-Keynesian, you don't know anyone who's a neoclassical economist. You never read their stuff. And I'm really of the view that I think both you find in Keynes, and you also find in Kalecki, that you actually, and you find it very, very strongly here among certain writers in Italy. It's something that I feel very, very sympathetic towards, that we must go out to talk to people of all schools of thought, try to understand as critique in the sense that Riccardo mentioned it as trying to find the truth in what they're saying, and then engage with the problems of what they are saying. And that I find is a much more mind-expanding approach to economics than just talking to people who agree with you. Let me...
2 minutes.
Oh my God. I was going to...
We are already out of our time.
Yeah, Keynes versus Kalecki on finance. I can say that Keynes was very much in the financial markets, and that's why what he wrote was about the operations of the financial markets. In Kalecki, the finances, from a different point of view, this is corporate finance. Kalecki understood corporate finance, and that's the fundamental distinction. The retrospective view, seeing the past in our present literature, this is a view over which I was challenged by Roger Backhouse after the first volume of Kalecki came out. I talked to him about it. This idea that we should read past economic ideas from the point of view of what is available, what we now discuss, This I agree with is wrong, and I tried not to do this in the biography, but he says that my last chapter in volume 1 is affected by this, which brings me on to the two things. One is at a previous presentation of this, Robert Skidelsky came along, and Joe Mitchell asked the question of what's the point of writing intellectual biography, and Skidelsky gave the best answer. He says, because economics is not the technical relationship between technical or an objective relationship between variables, as is currently taught in economics, but is always about the context, because it's the context that gives this significance. And I think that this is an important reason for doing this. On Schumpeter was not quite the dynamic economist that he appears as in business cycles and elsewhere. He also believed that the Walrasian general equilibrium was really one of the foundation stones of economic analysis. And his view on Kalecki was typical neoclassical. He said he couldn't see the point of Kalecki's analysis. It relied on shocks, and that in any case, the rate of interest would always make saving equal to investment. So, what was the discussion? The loanable funds theory. Two personal notes. I could talk about personal aspects of Kalecki for the whole day, but one thing that I should say that made research on him rather difficult is that Kalecki tended to destroy letters. He'd read them, tear them up and throw them out. He famously didn't have books in his house. His wife said that books like children gather dust and make a mess. That was... and a note which appears in one of Kowalik's memoirs of Kalecki, where he said that in the 1960s, the Yugoslav delegation, I think they're from Yugoslavia, a delegation of foreign economists came to Warsaw to visit Kalecki, and they spent the whole afternoon talking to Kalecki, and then went to see Tadeusz Kowalik, and they said to him, he asked them how the meeting went, and they said, the meeting went well, but they said, what's wrong with this man? You start, saying, you make conversation with him, and he starts quarrelling with you. So you argue with him, and then you agree with him finally, out of politeness. So you agree with him, and then he starts arguing with that. So this was Kalecki. He was unfortunately, as Harry Johnson said, he was rather charmless, but an interesting person nevertheless.
Ivan, where is the lecture of
I think 22.
econometrics?
22.
Okay. I think we may close just to very quick notes. The first, it has been named many times the modern monetary theory. You will have in your course Randall Ray and Yeva Nersesian, so you will have a lot of modern monetary theory. Also, the capital controls have been named. This touch a personal nerve. I was the main speaker in an audition at the Italian Parliament about the so-called Tobin tax. Formally, I was a supporter of the Tobin tax, but if one read what is written in the notes, one understands that I actually was in favor of capital controls, and I advised everybody to read a wonderful article of 1995 by Jim Crotty and Gerald Epstein, I don't know, in defense of capital controls. My point today about capital controls is about the scale. I think that one cannot think that Italy, as a small country, can reasonably enforce capital controls. Another thing altogether would be for Europe. And when I went to the Parliament, and I think it is also true today, nobody says that, but if you go to the Maastricht Treaty, it is possible to enforce capital controls up to a year in exceptional circumstances. And this reality changes, as the European Central Bank has taught us. I would not rule it out completely on a larger base. The fact that capital controls today can be used at a national level, that I would strongly doubt. But that's a personal position. See you next week.
You were very, very